Ohmies, welcome back to another interview of the week. It is Monday, the 6th of December, and I'm here with Wollemi, the Olympus Grants lead, and also in and around the DAO doing a bunch of other things. How are you going, Wollemi?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. We were just talking about, prior to recording, how OIP 55 is kind of gone to snapshot, and just a little caveat for those that when this episode comes out, it'll most likely, the snapshot will be finished. So it's looking like it's going to pass, which is exciting, but we can kind of get to talking about that later in the interview. But I think the first thing that I kind of wanted to touch on, and we touched on, I mean, you've listened to some of the podcasts, you know how it operates. I wanted to kind of get into, the crypto origins, and then the segue into, first crypto, and then the segue into Olympus specifically.
Yeah, I know the format. It's exciting to be on the show. I have to admit, just say up the top, I'm pretty nervous because there's like a certain degree of imposter syndrome as like a new Ohmie, kind of, especially with like the number of talented, brilliant folks inside the DAO is like between 100 and 200. So I'm sure there must be like hundreds of Ohmies with more time in the DAO than me. But I was, really honored that you reached out for a chat. But before I kind of hop in, I'm based on Wurundjeri country. So whenever I'm on a recorded call, I always make sure to just acknowledge that I'm on the unceded lands of the Woiwurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And I bring that up. It's kind of maybe unusual given that we're all mushrooms and in a non-space. But I bring it up because so much of my thinking approach and what I prioritize has come out of direct conversation with the spaces I find myself in and with peoples who've been on these lands for a lot longer than me, ancestrally speaking. And it's really helped to frame like my vision for like the P2P ecosystem and projects that I contribute to. So I kind of always want to position myself in relation to and give to kind of cite where some of the inspiration comes from. But so in terms of like my particular journey into crypto, it was around 2011 or 2012. I went to a kind of hacktivist camp in the north of England. So hacktivist kind of people who are kind of involved in activism, but then also doing stuff with computers. And this was in and around time kind of, Facebook was a thing by that point. It was becoming increasingly more dominant. It was clear that it was a force that wasn't going anywhere. But before Facebook emerged, there was patterns in organizing where we were kind of wrestling with and trying to figure out how we could use technology. One of the ways this manifested was in a project called Indie Media, which was essentially a federated network of people kind of posting news up to a website so that issues and topics which wouldn't necessarily be covered by the mainstream media could be read by folks around the world and inter-region.
That's awesome. Is it still going?
Less so. I mean, it is still up, but less so now because so much of the way the web has moved, it's kind of moved more towards this kind of social media, which has kind of filled a lot of that buffer. So anyway, I was at this camp. It was super rainy. It was beautiful, hilly countryside. And one of the kind of geeks was doing a presentation on this interesting curiosity called Bitcoin. And anyone kind of looking at stuff at that time, it was indelibly kind of linked to here's this cool technology and also people are using it to buy drugs online. So I think this was even before Silk Road. It was kind of using services from before that point. And I think people raise this just as like, this is kind of, potentially like an interesting thing. And I remember looking at it at the time and just being like, well, that's kind of weird. And then it next popped up on my radar. There was kind of an embargo by the kind of status quo payment merchant classes. So your Visa, your PayPal, your all of that kind of ilk of payment processors shut down the donations page for WikiLeaks after they'd released the files around I've forgotten what the name of it is, this particular release, but it was the one with like footage of the helicopter kind of looking down in Iraq. And they all kind of decided to switch off incoming donations to WikiLeaks. And if you track back, I think this was in, I can't remember, 2012, 2013. If you track back to the charts, you'd need to really zoom in because, of course, since then, when Bitcoin was like less than $10, it would all look like flat line now. But one of the first peaks that you see on the chart was basically a bunch of geeks around the globe kind of buying up Bitcoin so that they could send it directly to WikiLeaks. So you had this kind of like peak in price kind of before a lot of the kind of market pumping and market action that kind of came after that fact. I think it was the first moment that a bunch of us around, because, people buying drugs online or doing all of this type of stuff, it's a curiosity. People are going to kind of trade amongst themselves and find ways of making that happen. It was happening before cryptocurrencies via a bunch of mechanisms, so far as I've read online. The moment when there was this embargo by organizations which are core to the fabric of not just online life, but life, your Visa, MasterCards, all of those payment rails, the fact that there was now this technology that you could use to essentially say, hey, I actually don't agree with what was being called financial censorship at that time. And now we actually have a new tool in our arsenal to go, do you know what? No, don't agree. If I want to support that org because I believe in their mission and what they're doing, I'm going to. And I think it was around that time where I was like, me and some of the people kind of in the orbits that I hung around with were like, maybe took this stuff a little bit more seriously. And yeah, so it was kind of, to be honest with you, I'm this weird composite of a total noob. Like, I wasn't actually involved in tech in and around that time. I was just peripherally involved. And it was around that time that some friends, I expressed to some friends who were involved in the industry, I was like, I actually want to learn some more. Can you teach me something? So we'd get together, and the people that I asked were systems administrators. And so the very first piece of software that I actually was learning how to use, other than kind of your standard Unix stuff that systems administrators use, was, okay, let's set up this interesting piece of software called Bitcoin, and let's check out this mining thing. Like, what does it mean to add a flag to a piece of software? Where do the configuration files live? And that type of thing. So in terms of crypto, I'm like a gray head, gray beard. But in terms of technology, I was a total noob at that point. Like, it was my very first kind of introduction to, I was looking at that before I was looking at WordPress, for example. So it kind of,
Wow.
yeah, it
That's
informs
awesome.
some of how I show up, because one of the things that's made working with Olympus interesting is that because I've been around since 2012, 2013, I know a lot of folks in the industry just through virtue of having time in crypto. And we've been around the block a few times now. But then when it gets into the deeper tech stuff, I still just always have to put my hand up and go, I'm still kind of a novice on that level. But so since that point, I've been working full time in crypto since around 2014. I used some of the early kind of Bitcoin pump to pay for a coding course, and then I ended up leveraging that experience because I'm a university dropout. I dropped out of uni because mental health was kicking my ass. So I was just like, I'm out, and ended up going into a co-op. But then later on, I ended up doing a master's in advanced data analytics off the back of spending about 5 years in and around tech, where I spent time kind of doing data analytics on what I called more than economic uses of the Bitcoin blockchain. So this was kind of before the launch of Ethereum. I was interested in how people were using the Bitcoin rails for stuff beyond just like trading amongst each other. So the altcoin then would have just been like your kind of Dogecoin and what called colored coins or Litecoin, kind of tweaks in the code of Bitcoin, but not really a major differentiation. But then also Satoshi implemented within the Satoshi client, and other people have come since and created alternate clients for Bitcoin. But these kind of operational codes, opcodes, which would allow you to embed into the blockchain kind of transactions which bury different metadata. So I wanted to kind of do an analysis of the Bitcoin blockchain to see if, in fact, people were using it in that way. And then actually, yeah, ended up kind of running the Bitcoin blockchain on my small computer at the time. And I think I've shared this story online. Like, ended up frying my hard drive, and I kind of pretty much nuked my entire holdings of Ethereum kind of pre-launch ICO, and all of the Bitcoin I had kind of on the computer hard drive. I've got it sat on my desk. I just completely fried it. And because of me being,
No.
there was like, I think more than 1,000 Bitcoin, more than 10,000 Ethereum on that hard drive. And I've just completely nuked it.
Oh my God.
So I think that kind of highlights both the fact that I've been around for a long time, but then also I'm a total novice when it comes to tech and still fuck shit up. And I've got that hard drive on my desk to kind of keep it real, like to remind myself in moments where I feel like I know a lot, just to remind myself, like, you don't though, like you're still a baby when it comes to tech.
That's a really good thing to have close by, but it would also remind you that you've come so far as well, right? Something to humble you, but also something to motivate you as well, right?
Yeah, it's true. I find it like, it's, I don't run the calculator, but it's obviously worth a lot of money now. It was upsetting at the time. It was worth quite a lot then, but I think increasingly over time, there's this kind of class of us who we nearly made it in a like ridiculous, like unimaginable way. And then many of us will then not make it because we have in some way messed something up of our own accord, nothing to do with the external world. So I think I'm in like a quite a small bucket of people who would be like insanely wealthy but aren't because of some mistake that they've made. It's like a new human experience, like in the whole of the history of humanity, to be in this situation where potentially you'd be mega rich, but actually you aren't because, you've got this object which you can't access the data of. It's quite an interesting, I do wonder how many of us there are. I think it will grow over time.
For sure. I was going to actually ask that. I was like, what percentage of, how often do you think cases like that actually have happened over the last 10 years?
I think a lot of us don't talk about it because we feel stupid. And then it was like, it's also a tricky conversation to have with like friends and family and that type of thing. But I guess when we're talking about, and to be honest, I bring this up because it's kind of informed my entire trajectory in crypto since then, has been, if we're talking about technologies which are to democratize finance, which we're hoping will have a total addressable market of the entire planet, then like how can we figure out patterns and ways of using this technology which are a bit safer than that? Because, I can imagine for a lot of folks, this would push them towards the brink. It really depressed me the fuck out, and I burnt out a bit, and I had to find my way back from it. But I'm guessing, given the fact that this is to do with keeping data secure on your computer, most people, that's not an intuitive skill that is widely had. Even amongst technical folks, we make mistakes quite often. When you're talking about like your grannies, your grandpas, your folks who just use a computer to do email, it's a pretty high barrier to entry. And yeah, so to continue on the crypto story, basically ended up working on projects to do with decentralized private key management, got some funding from the Ethereum Foundation and Gitcoin grants to work on a bunch of stuff embedded within an offline enabled P2P communication system. And then off the back of that, moved into decentralized cloud storage and got some funding from the folks who funded Signal and Tor, and then also got some kind of a development of that. We then got some funding via a European funding program called Horizon 2020, which kind of was a European fund set up to kind of give an alternate mechanism for the production of technology, an alternate to kind of the more Silicon Valley kind of startup model of kind of VC-backed stuff that is turning kind of users into the product. So the European Union was like, we need alternatives to some of the technologies that kind of are underpinned by this philosophy that maybe we don't necessarily share. And so they've got kind of a stream of a vision of essentially enabling software produced that's conceived more a bit of like a publicly owned good or a public good that can provide an alternative to many of the functions that we have online. For example, the cloud, or like messaging, or any of the kind of stuff we're used to kind of embedded intrinsically in our experiences of organizing in the world. But just having projects where there's a focus on them being more to the end of public utilities, publicly owned goods, free and open source, with alternate business models that don't require kind of surveillance capitalism as one of the primary economic drivers and that type of thing. And then all of that kind of led into, in and around Olympus, I kind of, along my journey, met a bunch of people who I found very inspiring, clearly knew a lot more about tech than me, who were kind of into Bitcoin and all of these things really early. And although I myself don't consider myself a computer expert, I know a lot of people who are. And because I've known them over time, seeing what they're interested in, what they take seriously, and kind of they're often at the cutting edge of kind of what's exciting, not just technically speaking, but also kind of socially speaking. And that kind of brings me to, I saw a few of these folks kind of having references to Olympus. And so kind of it's that arc, that journey that kind of led me to the edges of Olympus.
That is a crazy journey. And I'm honestly going to have to go back and re-listen to all the interesting things you've mentioned. I've jotted down a few things, but like maybe we can kind of go into Olympus in a second, but like that kind of transition from, being kind of Bitcoin adjacent and really getting into everything Bitcoin and then stumbling across Ethereum. Did you kind of, was it something that you got in ICO times, and then essentially when everything shit itself in 2017, did you kind of take a break, or were you still kind of full-time in crypto before you stumbled across everything Olympus related? And then we can get into first impressions, Olympus, present day thoughts, etc.
The people who were teaching me kind of sysadmin and all of that end of the spectrum, they're kind of what you would call kind of Unix veterans. So very deeply technically competent, often veering towards like the older end of the spectrum, but not exclusively, who, through virtue of being experts in a domain area, kind of have strong opinions about technical architectures and the kind of how a technology is not just built, but also coordinated and organized and managed and maintained, and how new contributors are brought in. And so I'll admit that a bunch of the folks that I was in and around were really critical of Ethereum even before its launch. And for reasons of, I'd say, from a technical critique, they were like, I'm really not into it. I think the vision's too broad. And they just were not into it. So when I got involved in Ethereum ICO thing, I was a bit more at the like, I don't really know what all of you are talking about. Kind of sounds kind of okay to me, and YOLO, why not? So I did get involved in the Ethereum ICO. And I should also mention that kind of the communities that I've kind of come up within. So I was, broadly speaking, involved in cooperatives at the kind of directly democratic end of the spectrum. So kind of what I'd call analog versions of P2P, where kind of you don't have any specific boss. It's kind of horizontally organized. And I was involved in kind of federations of co-ops. So that's like a co-op of co-ops. So kind of a bit similar to how you see some of the emergent ways of organizing in DAOs online now, kind of, but in this analog old world business model, because co-ops have been around for as long as industrialization has been around as a counter way of organizing people to produce things. And so I bring this up because me being involved in this thing that was kind of speculative and to do kind of with finance was kind of uncool in my circuits. It's not something, more often than not, when people talk to me about it, when they hear I was involved, it would be with skepticism and kind of a critical caution. And so a bunch of the stuff that I've kind of done is both on the technical people that I was speaking with, they're a bit like critical of Ethereum, but then in my meet space life, also kind of critical. So it's always been this a bit of a not lonely path, but like it's been a bit like being a bit like a heretic. Like people can see that you're doing something interesting that you like, but then when they speak to you about it, they're a bit like, oh, I don't know about this. And so 2017, I just kind of YOLO'd in and out of various stuff. And compared to some other people, I didn't buy the top of the 2017 thing. What I did was maybe in its own way, like I appreciate people sharing things which they look back and was like, oh wow, someone's exit liquidity. It kind of really warmed me to folks who share maybe what could be deemed as failures. But so when the 2017 peak hit, I kind of had this euphoria because having been involved around since 2013, even though I'd made loads of mistakes, lost loads of stuff, it's a pretty easy circuit to kind of at least get a bit more of a bag again if you are like working for crypto for time and stuff like that. So the bag that I'd managed to recover, having lost this 10,000 ETH and 1,000 Bitcoin, was pumping, and I was like, right, okay, I made it, and then I didn't make it. Now I'm going to make it again. And I was like, what do people who've made it do? I was like, I know, I'll buy a house. So then my neighbor's house was put up for sale, and I was like, oh, okay, let's commit to getting that. And that commitment was made as like the 2017 kind of like one of what I thought was the peak, but actually it was a left shoulder. But then there was a crash and I panicked because I was like, I've made all these commitments, I've got to follow through. So then like I think sold the bottom of this kind of crash from the left shoulder. But it wasn't actually enough to cover all of like the taxes that I had accrued from chopping in and out of positions, all of the tax that was coming down the line, stuff like property tax, all of this stuff. I didn't know what I was doing. I'm sure a lot of people resonate with the fact that we don't know what we're doing. And then so it kind of cashed out at the bottom of that thing. Didn't quite have enough to cover all expenses, but that wouldn't unfold for like a year or two. And then saw the market like pump again, and I was like, I really not going to make it. This is awful. It felt really bad. I was like, felt shame, embarrassment, like stupid. But then also because of that, the context of my technical friends, I was like, I don't want to talk, like they kind of look down a bit on speculating on inferior technology. And then on my meat space things, people were just like not into speculative finance. So it's a bit like carrying this shame in a bundle just privately and quietly, which I don't know if others out there connect with that. And then kind of like spent the next 3 years digging myself out from like a very complicated tax situation with the HMRC, the UK Tax and Revenue Service, which was a painful process, which involved like court cases and a bunch of other stuff. The TLDR is they wanted a really massive tax bill that I didn't have the liquidity for. So then I needed to sell this place that I'd kind of bought, but Brexit was starting to kick in, and then the pandemic started to kick in. And by the time those tax bills came in, so it was just like horrible. But on the other, I then also during that time had like a kind of Bitcoin bag, and I was a bit at that point. I was like, this shit that I've just gone through, I don't want to like. I'd like to, even just for myself, have an alternate way of managing private keys. So then I privately funded, I put a bunch of Bitcoin into, I think it's like 100 or 200 Bitcoin into a multi-sig, and lobbied around with kind of a crew of people to work on a data management mechanism using this cryptographic technique called Shamir's secret, sharing, which allows you to split a secret into, for example, 7 pieces, and then you need like M of N or N of M. So for example, you'd need 3 of those pieces out of the 7 to recover the entire secret. So privately funded this kind of solution in the context of a P2P data sharing network, offline enabled. So the idea behind that is you actually have this function in Facebook where it's a bit like called trusted contacts. And that's if you lose your password, instead of having to, or some other aspect of your account, rather than having to go through Facebook, the org, you could contact your previously elected trusted contacts, and they could, in an offline way, confirm that it's you and give you back access to your account. And so
Wow.
we built out a thing which essentially is a bit like the Web 2 model of forgotten password. It's just in Web 3, there is no org central place which is managing our accounts. We don't even have usernames and all of this other stuff. But it's kind of that pattern, which, you know, think about all of the times you've pressed that reset password button. That's, you know, patterns like that are what make things accessible. And so we essentially built a system that allows one to press reset password, but instead of it being coordinated through an API connected to a centralized company, it would ping your mom, your cousin, your best friend, and someone else. And as long as 3 of them are around to confirm, they'd probably ring you and go, hey, DKD, did you actually request this? And they'd hear your voice and they'd be like, cool, yeah. And then they'd click approve. As long as 3 of the 7 people approve, then you'd recover your data. So built that through the 2017 build. It's when I look back at it in terms of, you know, when you hear me talking about any trading stuff on my Twitter, it should probably be a signal to do the opposite, because I'm like not a trader by any means. So essentially spent all of the crypto, most of the crypto that I did have in various bags during the 2017, 18, 19 downturn, like spent it all building this other stuff. But don't regret it, because it is cool tech that I think is going to be able to make some of the stuff we're working on more accessible from like a human layer of people fucking up, losing their passwords, losing their computer. And I think those are the realities of what happens in the mess of life when it comes to people and belongings. We all lose shit all the time, and figuring out patterns that allow us to do that still, but not lose 10,000 ETH and 1,000 Bitcoin. We need patterns like that to make this stuff actually accessible in a practical way.
100%. Well, personal experience is a great catalyst for change, right? In terms of even implementing change, like things that happen to you personally. Sometimes there's like that, that desire to really make sure that doesn't happen for other people, and it's like really how a lot of great things get built, right?
Hopefully,
and
either that or it was like a very expensive, like I just view it as like an investment in like a particular perspective, and I hope it's one that others share and find useful. And if not, then, you know, I've got the world's most expensive broken hard drive sat on my desk as like a, you know, a one-off piece. Maybe I should turn it into an NFT.
Ooh, maybe that's something I'm looking out for. Wow, that was a awesome segue into everything Olympus. Maybe you can kind of give us your, first impressions when you kind of saw some of the people, adjacent to what you were doing, kind of talk about it, and then maybe talk about like present day thoughts now, and then we can get into everything DAO and what you're doing in and around the DAO.
I'd love to hear more about what you're like up to on Comp and Agora side as well, but maybe that's another chat. So when I first saw Olympus, definitely a scam, 100% sure, and I was like, yeah, definitely a scam. Was super short, and then I saw some of these people that I mentioned, serious tech people, kind of who I know are involved in Bitcoin more or less from the beginning. I'm certainly one of them, like just deeply involved and having references to Olympus. I think of like glibly tweeted one of Olympus's kind of most successful exports has been the bracket something comma something bracket notation. And I saw a few of these people with like, bracket 3 comma 3 bracket or some other mix and match. And I was like, well, that's a reference to this scam. And that I don't get, because in this game, reputation is everything. When you get really deep into kind of people building and contributing to tech, which is like embedded in servers around the planet. So when we're talking about Unix or operating systems or this type of thing, reputation is more valuable than any other. Your skills are important, and ultimately that's the bedrock. But then your reputation for, in terms of when differences in perspective around implementation to do with core technologies which are embedded within the internet itself, reputation is just this really fundamental thing which people don't take. People are jokers, meme, shit talk, have fun, and they're serious. Like, when I saw folks who I had this like deep respect for on a lot of different levels referencing what I was sure was a scam or a Ponzi, it kept me up at night. Like, it got to the point where I was like, I'd wake up at 1 a.m. and I'd be like, why would you risk the rep that you've built up over decades and decades to like do something funny in a meme space? And to be honest, that dissonance, that cognitive dissonance, is what, because I was like, by this point 99% sure it was a scam, and 1% this cognitive dissonance, just enough, like a bit of dust in your eye. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just try and get this dust out of my eye, because at least if I can understand, then I'll be able to sleep. And that kind of started me off on this obsessive journey of just like reading every tweet I could come by, every Medium article, going through the Discord, looking at the code. And I think it took me about 2 months of doing that, because I had other stuff to do, parenting, gardening. There's been a bunch of like life stuff come up. So I kept coming back, and it got to a certain point where something clicked. And I was like, okay, it's not a scam. It's a really elegant system that kind of along some lines has properties of a scam-like system. So I've mentioned kind of one of the ways I assess the like mainstream economy is basically a bit like a perpetual Ponzi machine, in the sense that it essentially, like, through the capacity for states to just print money, to ensure that through taxation systems and having strong militaries and making the purchase of petroleum and stuff globally required to be bought via the dollar, that essentially that is you can see it as essentially a Ponzi scheme that it's a perpetual one that we can't get out from under. And Olympus as a system took a slightly purer version of this Ponzi-like system, the Fed Reserve, when it was still on the gold standard, and modeled itself on that, but says, yes, it needs to be backed. I was like, it's kind of like the Ponzi, except it's a purer form, and it's not a Ponzi, because instead of having cantillionaires, like people close to the money printers and all of these stakeholders where value flows from the base of the pyramid upwards, it's a system where actually it's encoded into the software and got pretty tight human coordination with these multi-sigs and the policy team and different departments in the DAO contributing to like how this thing works. It's just a bit more of an egalitarian system where instead of all of the value flowing to the few, it actually flows to all stakeholders in the system. And one of the reasons why I think I really empathize with why people like it's a scam or whatever is because, our defense mechanisms for like trying to spot when we're getting raw is just finely tuned because of the world that we lived in. And it took me a while to realize that it's just a subtle difference in Olympus, that it's to my mind kind of one of the more elegant things I've actually seen in my life. Certainly in the small amount of time over the last 10, 12 years in tech, it's something which kind of, once it clicked, a bit took my breath away. And I think once that click happened, then I was like, okay, I'm going to make an anon account. I'm going to just become part of the conversation, to join in, to chat with folks. And kind of, it's been a bit, I think that was around September 1st or so. And the 2 months before that, I was in stealth mode because I'm still kind of a bit socially in that realm where it's still, less so now. I'm noticing more and more people that I've been speaking to this stuff are coming around and being like, okay, what's the actual story here? And yeah, when I speak to them about Olympus versus pretty much any other project, it's clicks really quickly in a way that not many other projects have. But yeah, so I decided to go culturally anon into Olympus kind of for two reasons. One, that seemed to be the cultural pattern. So I just wanted to kind of follow suit. But then on the other, honestly speaking, when I was looking at it before, I was a bit like, I didn't want to look like a fool on main, getting sucked into a Ponzi when people are already kind of have been historically critical. And I was like, I just can't be bothered with the drama of that. So yeah, I became a mushroom. And the rest is history.
Good reason. The mycelium rooted under the ground, keeping the DeFi ecosystem afloat over time, right? Yeah, I like, it's crazy to hear that kind of trajectory, right? Like you going from being someone who is like, keenly studying things, an observer, to essentially now leading the OGP, which we'll talk about in a second. But how do you go from this someone who essentially just spawns up an identity, starts to understand things, observes, and then what's that kind of leap like into contributing for those who are like, I think maybe do have skills here and there, but just don't have that kind of maybe don't have the affirmation that they need, or maybe there's something to do with just like the making paths a bit clearer. It could be a multitude of things, but just wondering what your kind of thoughts on that specifically look like.
So I love the mushroom as a kind of entity to think with around this stuff. So what we see is the fruiting body. It will like often pop up overnight, and then underneath that there'll be kind of a vast network of mycelial threads. And I kind of think that analogy a bit holds with us as well. Like when we turn up as a mushroom, or some people turn up as a frog or some other kind of icon, some people use their kind of passport name and face. But kind of underneath, when you show up to these spaces, you've got this kind of vast network of life experience, connections, things you're good at, and that type of thing. So when I showed up as a mushroom, I just started talking with anyone who would talk with me on Twitter. Mainly that's my kind of serotonin drug of choice, a Silicon Valley brand of serotonin popper. It's like part of my nervous system now is before I take my shot of matcha in the morning, I'm like, okay, dose me up with at least like 4 flicks of Twitter scroll. And yeah, I would talk to anyone who would talk to me, and I'll do the same now as well. I don't look at follower count or people number. I'll literally talk to anyone who talks to me. I will talk to them, because most of us are mushrooms. You actually don't know who's on the other side, what they've done. Like you really don't know what they bring to the picture. So that's kind of the first thing I'd say is an openness to chatting with folks and seeing where they're at. And depending on like what you're bringing to the table in terms of your interests, your experience, your perspective, your questions, your theories on how things should work or not. As that becomes clarified over time, I think like find like. So I think what ended up happening was because of my background in cooperatives and this type of thing, I started looking at Olympus in a particular way. And then I noticed that I hadn't seen many people talking about it in that way. So in and around themes of universal basic income and kind of contributing what is your unique perspective based on everything that we've mentioned is, I think, a valuable, because we're all trying to figure this thing out as we go. It's so new that having this pool of at times at odds perspectives will kind of help to bring into focus what this thing is. And it doesn't have to be one thing to all people. Like it can have different zones of focus depending on who's kind of sharing a lens on these things. And I think because I come from a background of the last 10, 12 years of just contributing online to things and being part of conversations, I'm used to the practice of showing up and doing things rather than showing up and asking people what needs doing. Because I think oftentimes most folks are busy doing things and they're kind of focused on their lane and what they're trying to do, that when you show up and if you're asking someone to try and figure out what's something that you can do, it's more often than not, sometimes there'll be like a kind of a very clearly defined, well-scoped thing where it's like, actually very specifically at this moment, the dishes are completely clogging the sink and it kind of needs cleaning up. Would you mind? But in the space that we're sharing, it's a bit more kind of ephemeral coordination. Like there needs to be a bit more context. I'd say I was very used to kind of showing up and having a scan and seeing kind of how things flow, how things are organized, and then seeing if I notice any gaps and then just chipping in bit by bit. And I think the OGP, I think it was already, I showed up and helped to write the improvement proposal, the OIP, but I think it was already in people's minds as a thing that they wanted to see. It's just that maybe everyone already had their hands full. So when there was someone turning up talking about grants, universal basic income, who found interest in Taiki, a number of people like, hey, actually, that's a good idea. Do you want to help make it happen? That's the background for how I ended up jumping into it. So the TLDR on that, I think, is everyone showing up into this space. If you've showed up, you might feel imposter syndrome, but the very fact that you're looking at this thing means you're super early. And whatever it is that brought you to this space is unique and valuable, and there'll be something there that you contribute if you can contribute if you want. The next is make it easy for people to know what you're about. So come out of stealth mode, maybe contribute to conversations, find people who are having the type of conversations that light you up, that you would like to see more of, and just make it easy for people to see a bit what you're about. And like take a leap of faith and go to communicate kind of what you think you would like to see more of, because in all likelihood, if you're having those thoughts, there's some chance that other people will be as well. And what you might find is that there is already some thinking in a channel or a DM or somewhere where you'll get routed by other Ohmies to go, hey, you should talk to these people. And be open to talking to mushrooms without like that backstory. I'd say like that's certainly been my journey, and I've noticed it a bit with others in the sense that there isn't Olympus, so far as I've seen, it's not a hierarchical org where there's a clearly defined process with roles in terms of like a gradient of from order to entropy, from like chaos to an ordered way of doing stuff. There's a certain order and emergent order in how things are shipped, but the processes in and around maybe veer more towards entropy. So more might look a bit chaotic and a bit like a bubbling potion. And so I'd say don't wait for a clearly defined onboarding moment. Get into the mix, get into the bubbles, throw in some soap, talk with people, let people know what you're about. And then I think you'll find yourself started slipping into emergent processes that are actually kind of orderly in a certain sense, but you kind of need to be there to allow yourself to kind of fall into focus. Yeah, I don't know if that's been at all your experience, DKD, or like whether that vibes if you're kind of early onboarding thing, or whether it was different earlier on than it is now, because I imagine it must be to some degree.
Yeah, well, I think early on it was simply people who found a gap and filled it in terms of like needs that needed to be done in and around the DAO. And I think there was very little confirmation in what to do. And there was even at times very little affirmation in even if it was good or not. So you'd have a lot of people kind of jumping in and around on different topics or departments, proposing changes that were ultimately amazing, but it would take almost like 2 or 3 bumps in order to get that be something that, oh yes, let's pursue that. And that's not for everyone, right? Kind of presenting an idea and crickets for days, right? Or maybe like a couple, like, to the point where, if you're in a normal work environment, you kind of shoot out an idea and you get that like double kind of feedback from people in a physical place, plus you get that kind of emotional kind of feedback and feel good. So I think it's like doing that in a completely online environment is tricky. And I think you touch on it, like, I think it's like there's very much an order to the chaos, and it gets to a point, I think we've gotten to a point as a DAO where we're hitting kind of 150, 200 contributors, and the infrastructure that exists is just tricky to kind of execute with this kind of internalized chaos, yet actually having that order to execute. And I think it'll very much become a kind of thing whether the DAO can implement kind of these choose your own adventure games in terms of onboarding. So sort of kind of creating more optionality for new people and clearly defining things prior and giving people specific information for specific tasks, whether that's through like this very well thought out bounty board that acts as a onboarding tool. And then how's offboarding defined? There's like a lot of things that I think are up in the air. So I think it'd be really interesting to see how the DAO itself kind of comes up with a solution, but I kind of see it being more department to department based. I don't know if you feel similarly.
I mean, so there's a pair of South American, I don't know if they were like political theorists or like political science or even biology, but they're called Maturana and Varela, and they looked at autopoietic systems, probably totally butchering it, but I'll introduce kind of why I think about this stuff, which might make any mistakes I've made in interpreting what it is they study forgivable. But so far as I understand their research, they'd be looking into how complex cellular organisms kind of organize without any seeming hierarchy. And the reason I bring this up is twofold. One is a lot of their research has then gone into use in kind of machine learning and cybernetic systems. But then two, I was reading a book by a feminist scholar from the Caribbean called Sylvia Winter, and was talking a bit about the breakthroughs that Varela and Maturana had in their research. So I'll start there. Essentially, there was a lot of, and I'm not sure what the struggles were to do with, like probably not too dissimilar from nowadays, but there was a lot of student strikes, I think, against the university administration. They were talking about when there was the breakdown of these hierarchical ways of doing things, like these really strictly defined roles of student, teacher, or like blah. When all of the kind of social context that they were thinking within was kind of a bit mixed up and a larger degree of entropy introduced. They talk about a bunch of the breakthroughs that they had with the theorization of some of the mechanisms for how these cells organize within what they ended up calling autopoiesis, came from basically student sit-in strikes where the teachers were also in with the students. And they're saying like talking through the night in this more kind of open, discursive way where there wasn't this boundary between who's a teacher, who's a learner, who's a start, blah. It was just like this. They attribute the breakthroughs that they had in some of the blockages with some of their experiments and ways of thinking as coming from this kind of full of entropy, emergent kind of slight chaos. And I kind of remember that story a bit because a bunch of those mechanisms, now in terms of machine learning are so prevalent behind the scenes, embedded into some of our experiences online in ways that are invisible to us that we'll never notice. Like in some way are indelibly linked or can be with like spaces that break down some of the status quo ways for doing things. So I bring this up for twofold. One is, I don't think a bit of entropy and chaos is a bad thing. And I don't even necessarily see it as, what's the word I'm looking for? Unproductive. Because I think a lot of this stuff, the way that when we're trying to make new things, it's not going to necessarily unfold in a linear way. The other reason I bring it up is that in this research, so autopoietic systems, like how do different zones or departments, to use like a human formation, coordinate in a way towards some desirable ends kind of makes sense. So this thing that you talk about with like it being about departments and maybe having a smaller amount of context, a bit more of a boundary and some mechanisms for communicating between different zones would certainly be a way of doing things that we see mirrored in natural systems. And I think from my experience of working in federated co-ops and co-ops more tightly, that's kind of doing things in a federated way, but then having mechanisms that allow different zones to have shared mental models, as Asfi would put it, is probably the direction that we'd want to be heading in, from my own personal opinion. And I've kind of a bit seen, at least I arrived much later than you, it already kind of a bit feels like that's where things are tending towards a little bit with Odyssey, maybe with Agora, with, I don't know how we'll set the grants up, whether it's certainly going to be within the Olympus main server, but we'll have to see how stuff goes after the MVP, whether it makes sense to have its own zone in terms of like what's of benefit to all the key stakeholders involved in these systems and what makes sense. I know that was a long answer. I basically agree with you from like a lot of different threads of my own journey.
Well, I think we're all also like going to be, like, as you've kind of mentioned in this, what was it called? The
Autopoietic. So it's like AUTOPOIETIC if you're going to Google it. I don't even know if I'm saying it right.
No, I'm definitely going to find that, have a read and reference that in the podcast for anyone else who's interested. But yeah, it seems like we're trending towards that kind of self, also it's like we're a self-healing system in general, like from an economic sense. But I think from a productivity standpoint, I think we're very much like moving towards that. Like, well, the solution is, found through this kind of dance between organization and entropy. So I could talk about governance for hours, but I also want to talk about more specifically what you're doing in and around the DAO. We mentioned OGP, so that's the Olympus Grants Program, Ohmies. I'm on the committee, which I'm super excited about, but I want to hear more about going into that a bit more, and then also what other things in and around the DAO you're up to.
Yeah, so grants programs, I think they're pretty commonplace now, and I think it was an innovation that Ethereum introduced, in the sense that it's not an innovation in the sense grants programs are they proliferate widely and something that the legacy world there's a lot of. I seem to remember post ICO launch, it was one of the alpha drops, like back in the day, they were like, we're going to launch a grants program. And since there's been like an increasing number of them, and broadly speaking, I'd say like initially when the Ethereum Foundation had their grants program, it was a bit more centralized in the sense that you had a core team of people deliberating on an inflow of grants programs, and they'd have maybe a concentric ring of advisors from various aspects of the sector on a rotating basis to inform them. Then, so that would have been, not long after that. So sometime a year or two after that, you would have had the emergence of Gitcoin, who take the centralized model and say, well, what would happen if we actually kind of organize this on a kind of more along the lines of the decentralized nature of the space itself, and allow the ecosystem to signal support. And kind of what Gitcoin have iterated around is maybe having a portfolio of approaches. So you can have, for example, centralized curation. So maybe there's some mechanism where one of the orgs can curate which projects make it onto a list that then, in a decentralized way, any ETH holder or any Ethereum kind of universe tokens can send in back projects, and then they've got stuff like quadratic voting or matching. You'd have some pool of funds that would match incoming funds. And then now I think like some of the more like modern implementations of this stuff are a mix and match of these different methods. So maybe, for example, a more centralized committee that might oversee larger grants for like bigger deliverables, where there needs to be accountability, not just in terms of those delivering on the thing, but then also on the organization side, so the committee side, so we can know and have an accountability for kind of who's signing off on this, who's doing due diligence, who's doing who's making sure that milestones are being hit and stuff is on track. So, and then stuff more towards kind of the centralized, curated, but decentralized in terms of funding flows, all the way through to just pure, open, decentralized free-for-all. And so that's kind of the state of the union, the kind of literature review of kind of a bit what's around at the moment. In the first instance, the underlying primitive behind Give is Taiki. We've now got the plumbing to allow for the Ohmies to basically signal what they're interested in. And, you know, this is pretty groundbreaking. Like, on surface of it, it looks maybe more of like the same, but it's actually groundbreaking. We've still got to the gas cost of approving the contract and setting that up. But then once that's set up, you've got the capacity for redirecting yield in a gasless way. So at the moment, for people to signal support via Gitcoin, they're going to have to send principal and gas fees for all of these different things. Within Olympus, and with it being a rebate system, you've got the potential for something like, you know, more similar to the experience of what it used to be like on Ethereum, when we'd be like, hey, can you test my address and just send me some dust to make sure we can't do that anymore because gas fees are super high. You can do it on layer 2s or whatever with Polygon. But I think one of the innovations that Olympus is bringing in is it's more reminiscent of the past, where because if you're doing things within the rebasing zone, it allows you to redirect yield in a way that's gas minimized, which we'll have to see how this actually plays out. Might mean kind of even more kind of participation in selection of projects. So Olympus, in its first iteration, I think the end destination, as with most stuff happening in Olympus, is kind of getting it as close and as far along the decentralized vision as possible. And the starting point, I use this analogy in the forum discussion before the snapshot, is someone, username begins with B, was like into grants, but more into decentralization. And I'm worried about introducing a pattern that's centralized. And I agree with the person who wrote that. But I think in terms of the pragmatics and practicalities of rolling out a new system, it starts out initially a bit more manually, initially a bit more centralized, just so that you kind of set up the patterns, stand stuff up, make sure it makes sense. Once you've figured out kind of how to stabilize the system, that testing your assumptions, making sure that it works out in the way that you think it will, and if not, allows you to iterate. One of the green flags for Olympus that kind of is yet one of the million of green flags that I found around Olympus was, for example, in March, Zeus released the Medium, essentially saying, we'll be setting up with these multi-sig wallets and be implementing community decisions via Snapshot. But the vision is that we're going to be having all of this stuff be managed on-chain via the governance token, which also happens to be the token you're all holding. And the fact that Geom is released last week, the turnaround between March and shipping it December, that's really rare. It's like for a project to say, hey, this is the plan, and then to execute on it and deliver it. There are projects that are like, their market cap is astronomical, and pretty much all they've been doing since they launched is making promises and saying, we will do this. Most projects, to a certain degree, they announce, here's the plan, here's what we're going to do, and then maybe take a long time to actually execute on that. One of the things that really drew me into Olympus is this culture of almost no shilling, in a sense. It's like, fine, in this case, they said, okay, this is the plan, but they've delivered on it in 6 months. More often than not, it's a ship the thing and then talk about it afterwards. It's a build in the background in stealth mode, ship the thing, and then afterwards go, okay, here's the thing, it's in the world now. And it's kind of a remarkable thing. And Grants is going to follow that. It's born of the same culture, and it will follow that same pattern that we're seeing time and time again in Olympus of, it's going to initially look a bit more manual, a bit more like something that you've seen before, but we've got all of the execution expertise, vision, team to kind of do some really interesting, new, innovative, and novel things in and around the grant space that will be just yet another superpower that Ohmies can deploy and utilize through virtue of participating in Olympus. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear, your thoughts on, because I know this isn't something, I'm giving my personal opinion on this, and I'm sure you have your own, and each committee member does. I just want to add the caveat that kind of none of this is yet set in stone, because we didn't want to assume the community would back a grants program necessarily, but I think we're about 5 or 6 hours away from the end of the vote, and it's got 98% support. So I think it's okay for us to talk
Assume
in this way.
Things are going well.
However, just
sure.
add the caveat that we haven't, none of this has got a roadmap, and we've not got it clearly defined. But yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts, DKD, on that.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think so. There are some good. So I.O.W, I think, is the person you're referencing before. They bring up some really good points. About how the issue is more so the centralized versus the decentralized kind of green lighting certain things, and I completely agree with their take. But I'm also thinking about your take, and I think it's really important. The whole purpose of the committee, right, is to put that reputation on the line in saying that, look, we don't want to go about things in this kind of centralized kind of picking sense, but I think to begin anything and to be successful in anything, you need this quasi, kind of decentralized setup, which kind of moves towards that completely autonomous decentralized setup. And that's really, I think DAOs in general, the grants and program aside, I think DAOs in general are not fulfilling the autonomous part of the acronym DAO, right? And we're kind of moving towards that. And I think in terms of processes and the way that governance is done within certain decisions in protocols, I think the reason for the committee is to kind of essentially be like, well, these people have been in and around the DAO for a long time. They kind of have the DAO's best interests first. So there's going to be a certain section within the program that probably needs more eyes than kind of having the community vote for things specifically. So I think I kind of see it having different sections and kind of, or different tiers, so to speak, and essentially having a different, how each different tier has an approach, but everything goes through the same kind of routing, if that makes sense. And then over time, you would need less committee oversight, because you could kind of develop an autonomous system that routes things depending on XYZ criteria. So that's the kind of way I see it, is you need a kind of team to kind of execute things and set things up to become decentralized, because I think things are not magically decentralized unless it's hard-coded into some system.
Yeah. I think a bit of alpha. So we have had some chat. So we're going to be skipping straight to the hybrid model of having the larger investments being more tightly integrated with the committee, just making sure that there's the accountability for projects which have a bit of a bigger budget, just to make sure everything's delivered upon and stuff is kind of working in the best interests of Olympus and expanding the utility of OHM and OHM holders. But then there's going to be a class of projects that are incoming through the grants pipeline once we open it up, where probably the committee will back the projects in a baseline way, but then we'll post those projects up onto a section of the Give platform, so then Ohmies can further kind of signal support for the projects which they'd really like to see prioritized and build upon kind of natively within the Give platform. So there'll be some mechanism where projects are applying to do something which is of utility to Olympus. The committee will back it to make sure it's minimally funded to execute on whatever the foundational things are. And then if a project has stretch goals for, okay, if we had XYZ, then we'd be able to further implement blah. Kind of similar to how a GoFundMe or a Kickstarter has different tiers for, if we have this stretch goal, then this. And so kind of moving it straight away, utilizing the Taiki primitive in the give interface. So we're already kind of, as we launch, going to be moving towards that that hybrid model. And as you say, DKD, like the vision is ultimately it would be nice if we were able to essentially minimize centralized committee management once stuff has been set up and we're all more used to Geome and we figure out what the potentials are there. But yeah, off the bat, the alpha leak is I think there's agreement within the committee that we're going to just straight away be launching it into a hybrid model. So it's something Ohmies off the bat will be able to signal support for and participation. We'll be able to track analytics for like how many Ohmies within the 80,000 holders actively wanting to participate in sponsoring development in the Olympus ecosystem. And just to mention, like, this is a really talented, passionate people involved in this ecosystem, and I think it would be it's just worth mentioning that the more that our systems that we build can leverage the expertise and insight of all the Ohmies who are kind of dedicated in a particular zone, the better for all of us. So I think when I see people making contributions of move towards decentralization, as just for me personally, I'm like 100% yes, agree. I think the emergent intelligence of systems which can talents of all stakeholders and participants, they're going to win in this whole space.
100%.
I don't think there'll be many that would disagree in the DAO with that kind of sentiment.
But it's also one of those things people forget you need, because this, this hasn't really been done before. So you do need some kind of historical data to base some of these developments on. Right? They don't come from nothing, and they kind of need to be bootstrapped in this very specific scenario with the end goal of moving away from that like initial setup. That's the way I kind of see it anyway. I'm sure everyone has like a slight, their views may differ slightly, but maybe we can like talk about, how do you kind of look to empathize with like different views or ideologies when like constructing a proposal? Because I know myself, like when writing, it's really important to like maintain that level of neutrality. Otherwise you have to try your best to essentially present something in a voice that is as centrist as possible. So I guess, how do you kind of see Olympus moving beyond where it is now in terms of, having these kind of discourses on different proposals, but then also like, what do you think it takes from us to kind of leap from this protocol into an actual economy? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do we move into like, because that's where things are heading down that kind of direction. So I'm curious to see if you've had a kind of think about that, like next step up as a larger system.
I don't agree with the centrist thing necessarily, but I see what you're saying. My take on it is, my views and my personal background, broadly speaking, I'd get painted into the zone of left if we were to kind of put these barbarous like simplifications onto them. And I think it's actually personally totally valid and fine for people to essentially say, this is where I'm coming from, because I don't really believe it's possible to be neutral. Like, we've all come from a particular life experience and expertise which will introduce certain biases and perspectives which are kind of indelibly inked into both our conscious and subconscious. What I think is important is to acknowledge that that is the case for every human, and not all humans will have the same life experiences, views, and this type of thing. And so when I'm writing proposals, I kind of a bit don't think about it. I just make sure that what I'm writing is taking into account as many perspectives that I'm aware of as possible. And when something happens where people are like, hey, this hasn't taken into account my perspective, prioritizing hearing that new perspective to a point where I'm able to communicate back to that person, this is what I've heard you say, this is this is your perspective from what I've heard. Is that right? And just keep going through that process of checking that I've understood the other person to the point where they're like, yes, that sums up what I think. It doesn't mean I have to agree with them, but the process of identifying someone else's perspective to a point where they are heard by you and they say, yes, you've heard me, is kind of, yeah, I don't really, beyond that, I don't know what else we can do as humans, because we're never all going to agree. And that's also fine. Having a multitude of perspectives and trying to find the commonality, the union, the intersection is going to be of benefit to a system like Olympus. And then the ultimate vision for how we win in the broader economy is, I think, like I shared, ultimately, I think we sink into the invisible realm and you start seeing Olympus in terms of powered by Olympus and nothing more. You don't really see anything more under the hood. And then practically speaking, how you get there, I think it's more just a case of, I don't know, more of the same. We seem to be tracking in that direction.
Yeah, I think we've already touched on like everything that kind of answers that last question you posed, right? But I think the way it'll unfold, I think none of us will be able to predict in which way it'll be successful or not. So, but along for the ride, and here until it goes to zero, essentially. So maybe we can talk about maybe something a little bit off topic. Does the kind of Zeus is Grimes kind of thesis still hold? Is there any kind of like conspiracy theories, or well, they're not conspiracies sometimes, maybe just theories in general that are perceived as conspiracies, that you're like certain of, that are kind of actual truths, for example?
I love conspiracy theories. So basically, I mentioned I dropped out of uni when I was like earlier in life, and part of that was like my mental health just kicking my ass, and ended up having to drop out. And there was a bunch of other stuff which is probably a bit too off topic for even now, but one of the outcomes was that I felt really like out of sync with what I perceived to be kind of everyday life and what people are up to, and kind of in that state of a bit of dissonance and kind of a bit out of focus or not on the same wavelength. I got really into a whole bunch of conspiracy theories. Like there was this one called Cutting Through the Matrix. There was an Alex Jones back in the day, but he was like still as shouty, but a bit less like, I don't know, a bit less Alex Jones. The 9/11 stuff, New World Order, all of this, like I found that in the headspace that I was in, there was something that resonated with me. And I think it was when I look back and reflect on it, and that this was also like climate change is a conspiracy, and all of this, like a bunch of stuff online. And for some reason, in the kind of a bit like, I don't know if this tracks for others, but it's just my story. So I'm not making any kind of projections onto other people's experiences. But I know for me, I found there was it was a bit like the vibe in those zones kind of suited the vibe that I felt in that moment, which was a bit like jaded and like out of sync, I'll call it. And, I was in that headspace for like quite some years. And the thing that I really love about being in that headspace and kind of that kind of disposition is like trying of your own accord to drill down into things and build up from first principles. And I'm not saying everyone into online theories does this necessarily. It's just my experience of it. I really love the mental model of being critical of things. Like, is this true? Is that right? Like, does that track? Like, what's the reasoning behind that? And I found that I bring a lot of that kind of critical thinking tools with me. And that's been incredibly useful in crypto as well, because as I mentioned, a lot of the spaces that I orbit in, it's not socially rewarded to be involved in this stuff. In fact, there's a lot of friction around it. For me, though, with a lot of the conspiracy theories, I still think like 9/11's inside job by US government, whatever. But the thing that I've moved away from is needing there to be a like coherent, orchestrated, organizational thing happening in the background. And I think it's just highly improbable that you've got a set of the planet or whatever who can like coordinate so well that they can orchestrate a like massive ulterior plan. Like that's a bit of a like pragmatist point of view. But then on the flip side, I also don't think it matters for most of us if there are these like mega big conspiracies happening in the background, because in our day-to-day lives, like we can't necessarily affect change on that level. And I think sometimes, and this is at least how I kind of moved out of that resonance or that way of thinking, was I noticed that the critique I had of, what in that realm is called sheeple or whatever, like people who just kind of follow the crowd. One of the critiques I noticed is like, there's a lot of, it's almost like by flipping from a dominant way of thinking through to the counteractive way of thinking, it's kind of like you're moving from one wavelength to another wavelength, and you're kind of, it's a bit of a type of kind of a group think. And so that kind of meta level critique of like, want to just jump from one way of thinking into another way of thinking. I kind of want to be a bit more fluid with like how I take in information and just make up my own mind. And so, yeah, I noticed that when I spent too much time obsessing over and thinking about conspiracies and all of this other stuff, it kind of inhibited my own capacity for action in my day-to-day life in a coordinated kind of coherent fashion. Ultimately, it was just that recognition where I was a bit like, it kind of doesn't matter, and it's stopping me from doing the stuff that I want to do. So that was a bit how I frame, but I love it as an avenue. I know it's a thing that some people go through, especially in our online age where people spend a lot of time online reading into stuff and that type of thing. And I think it's like a bit of a superpower in terms of it has a lot of potential for being a thing where people can like learn ways of looking at things critically and figuring out their own mind.
Yeah.
And the risk is that you end up just like copying other people, and it can stop you from doing your own thing. So I think that's like one of the pitfalls. I don't know if that's what you meant when you brought up conspiracy theories. I think about it a lot.
Open-ended, like, I mean, because I saw the tweet how the kind of Grimes is Zeus thesis, and I found it very funny. And you make such a good point about, regardless of what you're doing, it's like a very open-ended way for people to figure out how to critically think in context that you're normally not taught how to critically think. Where it's like, I guess it's kind of branded as a conspiracy, so you're trying to essentially analyze it and debunk it. So you look at it from all different angles. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting take on it, and that's kind of what I wanted. The reason why I brought it up, and also just whether the Grimes equals Zeus
Here's the thing
Grimes is actually the case.
Let's weigh up. Have you ever heard Zeus and Grimes speak at the exact same moment?
No.
Okay, so Grimes is currently how old?
She'd be late 20s, wouldn't she? Yeah,
33.
somewhere around there.
33.
Oh, she older. There you go.
Right. So we have a 3-3 person cosplaying as a younger person wearing I'm a bit being facetious here. The main reason is a friend who I was onboarding, and this is kind of one of the things I do. I've onboarded about like more than 100 people into OM, none of them crypto native people. In 2017, I onboarded about 50 friends and family into crypto, and I essentially paid people to learn how to use a password manager. I said, if you come to a workshop where I teach you how to use a password manager, I will give you some Bitcoin. And so 50 people came along, they learned how to use a password manager. I set them up with a Bitcoin address. I've got like a track record for onboarding people. And so when it came to Olympus, there was like, by that point, I'd had about a list of 200 people who I onboarded into crypto at some point in the past. And I was like, okay, I've come out of stealth mode now. There's this system that I'm sorry to ask you to do something with Ethereum, given the gas fees, but this is pretty much worth your time. And when I was onboarding one of those friends, they were a bit like, well, how is this different from Grimes's thing? And I was like, what's Grimes's thing? And then she sent me a snapshot of a media response. So Grimes at the time had been stalked by some paparazzi and was reading a copy of Marx Capital, I think. And in the response, I think it might have been on Instagram. I don't use Instagram, so I wouldn't have seen that. But yeah, my friend sent me this thing of basically, it was a comment by Grimes just essentially saying, no, I'm not a communist. I do like some of the ideas in Marx. I think they're kind of okay. But to be honest with you, I think the future is probably going to be more like something like a UBI with game-like qualities. And so when my friend was like, how is Olympus different to this decentralized UBI with game-like qualities? I was like, it is not. And then I was like, aha, Grimes is Zeus. And then it kind of went from there. So
logical step.
Yeah, I was like,
I would 100% be in the same boat.
Yeah. So I meant it as like, I don't know, just joking around. And I think I'd made 2 or 3 of these posts. And then I think the Sunday after the last post I made, then Grimes did her 3-3 post. And then, from that point onwards, whenever I'm talking to or about Zeus, I just say Grimes.
Yeah. I know it's a fun little joke, but I thought I'd bring that up because I thought that was a funny topic to touch on. Look, we could talk for another 2 hours, but I know that we've got to wrap this up for the Ohmies and ourselves. Why don't we phrase Olympus in one sentence for someone listening to this to send to someone else, and we can just tell them to skip to this last minute so we can consolidate everything we've talked about in the last hour and a half. And how would we sum that all up for someone in a little synopsis of what Olympus is and where the story of Olympus is going, I guess?
By getting involved in Olympus, you are securing a slice of the future pie, and it's fun. That's how I'd frame it.
That's it. That's perfect. That's all we needed to touch on. Wollemi, that was awesome. I really appreciate your time. We're going to get you on more Twitter Spaces for the Asia Twitter Spaces because the Ohmies need these long-form conversations that aren't just in podcast form. Where can we catch you on Twitter? I know where I can catch you on Twitter, but let everyone else know.
Wollemi Pine on Twitter. I'm fairly active there, up for chatting to anyone. Feel free to reach out.
Yeah, awesome. That is Monday, the 6th of December. That's the interview of the week for this week, Ohmies. And we've got another blockbuster week ahead, which we'll provide the scope for soon. But until then, catch you in the next one. Thanks, Ohmies.